having been here last year and talked at the time a little bit about my apps, a question that I got after I talked about my apps a lot was about software development, about specifically, I have an idea. The scenario is I have an idea. I'm looking for developers right now, but is there anything I can do right now so that I can help to springboard the process once I find developers? And for me, that was an easy answer. I've been doing software development. Actually, I can switch to the next slide. Background on me, I've been doing software development for 15 years in consulting and training. And about 3 years ago, I decided to take a look at iPhone apps. And 2 years ago, I put KidCalc into the App Store. And it did well, so it wet my whistle, and I was interested in keeping on that path. And so I left my job almost 18 months ago now and put 1-2-3 Color together. They both did well. Both actually reached #1 in the education category for their period. And continued on that vein for the last year and a half. So on the day the iPad 2 came out, I actually crossed the threshold of 1 million downloads. And thank you. And so in that time, and for the past 15 years altogether, I've learned quite a few lessons. So 3 in particular. I have a thick head, so it took a while to learn some of them. But lesson #1 is that there are several common causes of disasters for software projects in general. This isn't necessarily specific to the iPad or iPhone. But those disasters, did I start my timer? I didn't. Okay. Don't bring the cane out prematurely. So missing, unclear, or overlooked requirements are really one of the biggest causes of projects that don't go as planned. And by disaster, I should say, I mean projects that end up costing more by far, maybe twice as much, or even in worst case scenarios, much more than twice as much as you planned, or blowing the timeline, blowing the project plan, and having the project finish way later than you intended to or thought it would originally. So missing, unclear, or overlooked requirements, and that's beatable by thinking about how you need to put down on paper, how you might be able to put down on paper what it is that you're looking to have a developer build, or even in the case where you're building it yourself. I think a structured way to get those requirements down on paper can help you avoid missing them. Invalid assumptions in the case where you hire a developer to build an app for you. If you've missed a requirement or you've missed communicating a given requirement to your developers, they may make assumptions, and they may not be the right assumptions that prevent you from ultimately getting the app that you want. And then priorities, unstated or unclear, is another reason. Lesson #2, developers are interesting creatures. Surprised anybody? I should say they are. Did you notice how I said that they're interesting creatures, right? What makes them interesting, and maybe unique in some cases, is that in contrast to most people, they're extremely analytical, very literal. That's actually a good thing. I'd like my attorney and my developer to be very analytical and very literal. But it might mean that if you don't tell them you want something to be built or something to work a certain way, they may not do it the way you think they will. So it needs to be explicitly stated. And then, like other people, they make invalid assumptions sometimes. They're influenced by their biases, and they may not remember, even if you do tell them verbally in a conversation about what it is that you want them to build, what your idea is. Ultimately, again, they may forget, and they'll either leave something out or build something the way they think it should be built and not the way you had conveyed maybe in a conversation verbally to them. So, good things happen. Lesson #3: good things happen when you feed your developers, not iPads, but when you give them the information that they need and in the format that they need those requirements to be communicated, and that helps a lot. So we'll talk about that. Actually, where's Darren? Darren, I don't know how short on time we are. If you need an excuse, you don't have to read this. I've adapted Hamlet for the purpose of this, and Darren and I had volunteered yesterday to read it for us in Shakespearean energy. I thought we'd have some fun with this. Age-old question, whether to document requirements or not.
How about we tag team it?
Oh, no, we didn't talk about that yesterday. I didn't plan for that.
You got?
Here we go.
You'll tag your team?
Yeah.
You want to start?
What are we doing?
I'll start.
Line for line? Or?
I'll go line, you going.
Okay.
2, To document or not to document? That is the question.
Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer missed requirements,
The slings and arrows of outrageous memory leaks and app crashes,
or to take arms against a sea of troubles I blame on my developers.
and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, to shelve the project.
No more. And by a sleep to say we end.
The heartache and the 1,000 natural failure points of a software project.
That flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation.
Devotedly to be wished, to die, to sleep, to shelve the project.
To sleep perchance. To dream of an iPad in the hands of each of the world's children.
For in that sleep, what dreams of beautiful apps may come.
When we have shuffled off this deliverable,
Must give us pause. There's a respect for developers and designers.
that makes calamity of so long life.
For who would bear the whips and scorns of exploding budgets,
The project manager's wrong, the developer's contumely,
the pangs of
despised bugs, the deliverables delay.
Copyright Steve Glinberg. Modification, publication, reproduction, or distribution without prior explicit written permission from copyright holder is expressly prohibited.
I'm glad we have that clear. Okay, so continuing with Shakespeare. If that doesn't have you convinced to document, then this will, to get your ideas down on paper. So we have a project owner who says, I'd like it to be yellow with black stripes. We have a developer who says, I understand exactly what you want, right? Of course. And clearly they are on the same page, right? So what comprises this requirements documentation? It's a long and arduous list to get through. There are a bunch of synonyms. I wrote it out so we have users. We don't identify our users early on to our developers. We miss an opportunity to really connect on who those users might be. A list of user actions, and you'll notice I have a star next to that. The asterisk, extremely high value. If there is very little that you do, it's the user actions that are most important. And beyond that, a scope document helps as well. Functional requirements, the second, third, and fourth bullet. List of user actions, scope document, and scenarios. Rules, so custom logic, conditional logic. I have a few of these described a little bit later, and then, by the way, we have breakout groups that we'll get into to talk about these in detail if you're interested in that. Screen mockups, project priorities, and non-functional requirements. That's a mouthful. But before we go into each of those, I just wanted to say really clearly, this is what developers do in a nutshell. Developers build an automated response to an action that's taken generally by a user. And I said users here. A little bit later on, I talk about the fact that the system, we consider a user as software developers, so we consider that the system may have events or actions that we need to respond to. So typical users, a child, to the extent that we can articulate out a target user, parents, maybe we have an expectation that the parents will play a role in an app, and so we make that clear too. Teachers also, and then the system. User actions on that list, again, this is the first one that is really at a bare minimum, if you do nothing more. Do this, answer the question, who does what, repeatedly, over and over and over for each of your users or user roles. So the obvious, child begins gameplay. Child views a high score list. Parent selects a lesson. Teacher changes the complexity level. These are common user actions. They're very simple to write. Again, answering the question, who does what? The system auto-locks the phone. That, for example, is an action that we as a developer need. Now I'm including myself in the pool. It's okay at this point. We're not bizarre creatures. The system can auto-lock the phone, and we need to program a response, a behavior, in response to that action that the system takes. The system displays a calendar event. So if you're testing ultimately these user actions will feed into your testing, and you're testing that your app still works even if a calendar event appears on the screen while your game is being played. User powers off the device. User launches the game while a phone call is in progress. I put that on the list primarily to point out who can tell me what happens, what's different about the iPhone if the call is in progress. Anybody? Does everybody know you can be using your phone? Generally, if we're using it, we can then turn it to speakerphone, home the phone app. That's my new word. Very proud of myself. And then we can go and use any app on the phone while that call is still in progress on the speakerphone. What's different is that the status bar at the top not only turns green, but it also turns to 40 pixels instead of 20. And I can't tell you how many apps I've seen this on, where during a phone call, the screen layout doesn't adjust to accommodate 20 more pixels missing from the screen space. And then the phone, in some cases, apps will become unusable. In rare cases, but in some cases, they'll become unusable. Maybe less severe is they just become a little bit embarrassing for the developer who didn't consider that system action. User might plug in headphones. I can tell you from experience, I had a bug where it only occurred when they plugged in headphones. So again, more things that can happen. System returns an app to the foreground. This happens when you leave an app and then you come back to it. And how do you, as a designer or a project owner, want your developer, if that's not also you, to handle that scenario? If the system, again, returns the app to the foreground in the middle, perhaps they left the app in the middle of gameplay. And so you need to think about what you want to happen. And I have a slide to talk a little bit more about that. Oh, actually, first we have a fun demo. So identifying user actions, we saw Warren sort of pounding on the iPad yesterday. I think Walter was demonstrating at the time. And that's the same sort of thinking of how do I identify all of the actions that a user might do to my app. But also, again, I would advise not to forget that the system may take a lot of actions on your app. So, for example, the network connection might just go down if your app relies on it. That's something that you need to plan for. But again, to fully identify that list of potential user actions that you might want your developers to code a behavioral response to, you really have to know the platform and identify what are all of the contingencies, what are all the things that can happen with each of these different pieces of the platform. So I thought I would do a quick demo, multi-touch. Can anybody here tell me how many touches the iPad can detect simultaneously? I hear 16, 11, any guesses? 5? Anybody? Okay. So I have Instinctive Code put out a great demo of touch testing. So we have 5. We have 10. Okay. You can save me from using my nose. Yes. We have 11. We don't have 12. Okay. That was fantastic. So we have 11. So again, understanding that you have the option to track 11, which is more than most kids would give you. But I suppose there was one kid who was eating with his toes, so we might have more than... You're going to make me do it, aren't you? Don't do this at home. The kid eating with the fingers and the toes, they were putting food during, I think it was Caroline's presentation. So that's how. But again, the likelihood is maybe minimal that you will have a bug that occurs only when the 11th touch point is reached, but it is if you're building an art app. I know somebody who has. If you're building an app that does multi-touch, you want to be thinking about that. Or if you're thinking about different apps you might build, again, knowing that it can handle 11 can help you shape your app and might even open up for you creative ideas about how you can build your app. It really is the number of points that touch the screen. And in fact, when I was right, and if I'm really good about it, I can put my thumb knuckle down and get us an 11th one. Yep. In that case, it depends. Again, that's a scenario you should be thinking about and testing if that's relevant. The screen could, but if you bear that scenario in mind as you're developing it, you could choose as a developer to only use one of those 5 points. Maybe the most important. You could also choose the most persistent, for example. Lots of ways you could handle it. You could do that as well. So you could detect that there were transitions from 3 to 5, down to 1, down to 0.
Here's the point there.
You would have to get people that while as you were developing, as you were talking to the developers, to be able to articulate it.
Yep.
So you're in essence, you're presenting the product as you like it to play.
Right, and that's sort of the point of the presentation, is to make you think about what is occurring there and how you can communicate that. So you can anticipate a scenario that says the touch points may change, and as they change, here's how I want to handle that. So you can talk in a dialogue with your developer about ways you have, alternatives you have.
If you're left-handed or right-handed.
Again, I think context matters for the app, but certainly, I mean, we can distinguish between sides and transitions. So just planning for the contingencies that are relevant to your app is important. But knowing that this is an option really is, I think, the first step for that, which takes us back to the idea of really knowing all of the features of the platform, knowing them well, and especially the relevant features.
Like you're saying, we had 11 fingers, but what if you had 3 fists? Like,
right. So again, it's not based on pressure unless you incorporate the use of the accelerometer, which Apple actually did with GarageBand. So the heavy typing on the keyboard is detected as a hit that affects it gravitationally, and therefore we can detect how hard. But that requires a hit, not necessarily how hard I press. And actually, I'm going to be out of time if I don't whiz on by. So scope document. This is just simply aggregating user actions together. And I have a note on here about prioritizing your user actions. And the reason is, as your budget is constrained or fixed, but with time you get less built than you anticipated, you may need to rein in the scope on your project. If you prioritize your user actions that you're handing over in a long list to your developer, and at some point you're constrained on budget or time, you can simply raise the bar on what meets the threshold or what makes it within the bounds of the first version of your app, leaving the rest of the highly prioritized user actions to be in the next version. Let's go back then and take a look at it's going to make me do this. Here's the slide. What? Excuse me one second. Okay, plan B. Good reader. So we have, let's say this is the scope that we intend to build. So version 1 of our application, we want all 10 of these user actions to be responded to programmatically with some form of behavior. If we discover our developer is only through number 6, and they're also 90% of the way through our budget, we might say, scope 1, we're going to raise the bar. As long as these are prioritized, we're just simply going to scope out 8, 9, and 10. Finish up the building number 7, and go on and call that version 1. So again, the recommendation I would make is you first produce a list of all user actions you care about and beyond, and then prioritize that list. Does that make sense? So then at that point, at any point, you can change the line. Exactly. Yep. Okay, so a scenario is the other alternative. It's sort of the step beyond. And again, let me just go back here. this is the list of items that comprise requirements documentation. And again, I said, do those items in this order, top down, and if you can, do the top 3. If you have the time and energy and confidence to go beyond, go to the point of putting together scenarios. And scenarios are simply taking these user actions and then articulating behaviors that we want to follow if that action occurs. Does that make sense? So in this case, if the user launches an app while the phone call is in progress, we want the screen to respond, the adjustment in height of the status bar. If it happens to be that the gameplay was underway during the last use of the app, in this case, we want the gameplay to start out paused if a phone call is underway. And in addition, while the call remains active, we want to allow them to continue the game perhaps, but we want to suppress all sound effects while the call is underway. So again, just understanding these different things that can happen while your app is being used, network going down and so on, calls being made, we can then respond appropriately, or we can give our developer the instructions so they don't have to make assumptions and fill in the gaps. Rules are just conditional logic. If a condition is met, then I want you to do this instead of maybe what you would do if the condition is not met. And you'll see I incorporated a rule into the number 2 line item here under this scenario, if the gameplay was underway before they left the app last time. So that's an example. Number 2 there is an example of a rule. So before we break out into the groups, just in summary, if we provide our users a list of user actions, that's even longer than just the scope of our first version. Even our second and our third version, we enable our developers to plan ahead, sometimes even for free, lay groundwork or plan to go down, if they have a fork in the road, the right road, knowing what's coming in version 2 or version 3 of our app, so you don't end up with a house where you intended not to put a fireplace, for example, in the basement, and then you build the house. If you knew you were going to put a fireplace, you probably wouldn't put a living room directly above it, for example. And so providing a list of detailed scenarios can help because, again, you're just embellishing those user actions with details about how you want them to respond, and defining the scope for 2 or more versions so they can plan ahead. Lowering the overall cost, again, comes from the fact that they can make the right decisions early, knowing what might be coming. And again, it's just a might. It doesn't have to be that version 2 ever gets built, but at least they can plan accordingly, where it doesn't add tremendous cost. Lowering the chance of overlooking important requirements saves you from the case where your developer delivers the app to you and it's missing critical components, for example, or it looks entirely unlike what you intended, and that brings the third bullet. Raising the likelihood that you actually complete your project on time. If it's delivered to you at the maybe 80 or 90% of your budget point, and you look at it for the first time and realize that requirements have been left out, you're not going to hit the finish line on time with that app. With that, I thank you. Yes? Question?